Absolutely delighted to welcome everybody to the thesis defense of Derek Sowers. It's always fun to have one of these, especially when it's a nice one like this. Derek came to us with a bachelor's of science in environmental science from UNH, which you got. Well, it was a long time ago. 1995. Huh? That's some time ago. And then an MS in Marine Resource Management from Oregon State University. And you got that in 2000. And then between then and about, I guess 2013 or so, you worked mostly for NOAA's National Estuarine Research Reserve and the EPA's National Estuarine Program, both in Oregon and in New Hampshire. And I'm trying to remember, I think the first time I met you, you weren't associated with UNH at all. You were actually still with the reserve program or something like that. It was at some CMECS meeting, something like that. And then I think Derek saw the light and said, he wanted to go on and get a PhD. And I'm trying to remember back. I think the order was you started as a full-time PhD student. Is that correct, Derek?
No, I've never been full-time.
Never full-time. Okay, so you started the program coincident with part-time work. Since I guess about the last 7 years, you've been working for NOAA's Office of Ocean Exploration as an expedition coordinator, and bragging that you have 26 expeditions under your belt. You're not gonna catch up with me. I'm sorry.
It's not my goal.
Yeah, believe me, it's not one you wanna aspire to. I want to take the opportunity to thank your supervisors and the management at the Ocean Exploration Program. First of all, for allowing the whole group of mappers from OER to kind of cohabitate with us at the center. I think that's very beneficial to us and hopefully beneficial to them too. But I also want to thank them for letting you and Mashkar also take the time to do your thesis. I think that's really important, and I believe that we've all really benefited from that, and I hope we can continue that kind of relationship. I also have to say that it's been an absolute pleasure working with Derek. He's a delight to work with, and I suspect that we will continue to work with Derek. He'll just change from being a student, and we'll stop sneering at him, and he'll be a full colleague then soon after this event. So the format will be that Derek will give about a 30 to 40 minute presentation, and we'll do that in this venue. And again, I apologize that we can't be all together. I'd much rather we could have been together, but obviously we can't. I'd like you to hold questions if you can during Derek's presentation. It's a little difficult to have things interrupted in a virtual environment, but if something is really pressing that you need a clarification, particularly for the committee members, feel free to somehow wave your hands or put a note in the chat box, and we'll try to interrupt Derek and get his attention and get that clarified. But hopefully after his presentation, we'll have an open question session for both the committee and the public. I'd like everybody to hear the questions. And again, you can do that by, you turn your cameras on, you can wave if you want, you can put a question in the chat box. We'll try to monitor that, and there is, I'm sure, a way to raise your hand too on the Zoom platform. So any of those ways, and we'll try to get your attention. When we've kind of run out of steam with the questions, we'll ask you all to sign out of this session. We'll have another session that'll be just for Derek and the committee, and the committee will either continue to ask Derek questions or just deliberate, and then we'll see if the white smoke or the black smoke comes out of the chimney. Keep an eye out for that in the near future. I think that's about it. I ask you all to keep your microphones muted. And I think if the bandwidth holds up, it doesn't hurt to have your cameras on if you don't mind. It probably helps Derek to see faces, see people sleeping or with great enthusiasm. So do if you can, keep your cameras on. I think that's good. But do keep the microphones muted, except for Giuseppe, because if the baby wakes up, we all want to hear the baby and see the new baby. Okay, so let me let Derek start, and you can introduce the committee too. I think you'll do that in one of your slides. Is that true, Derek?
They're actually at the last slide as an
Last
acknowledgement.
slide. Okay, so why don't you start by introducing your committee?
All right, well, let me get the slideshow going here, and we'll do that. Just want to make sure the screen gets booted up. So I just want to introduce my committee. You just all heard from Dr. Larry Mayer, my advisor for the past many years of this adventure. Jen Dykstra is also faculty there at UNH CCOM. She's one of the rare ecologists that works kind of in the mapping realm as well. It's been a pleasure to collaborate with Jen on bringing sort of a biological focus to some of this work. Dr. David Mosier is also faculty at UNH, as well as serving on an international committee that helps determine the scientific basis for international nation states to make claims of extended continental shelves. And he's kind of the, I guess he'd be the Larry Mayer equivalent historically for work in Canada, lots of extended continental shelf work up in Canada and in the Arctic as well. Mark Finkbeiner is a key architect of the Coastal and Marine Ecological Classification Standard, which is the accepted standard for the United States, which I used in this study, and has been a critical advisor on how to apply that standard. And Dr. Catherine Ford works in Massachusetts for the Department of Marine Fisheries and does a lot of work with habitat mapping, as well as sort of in the pragmatic realm of how to interact on permitting issues and things affecting fisheries. So that was a very brief introduction for some very accomplished folks in the field. And I'm just going to go to the first slide. All right, so my talk today, utilizing extended continental shelf and ocean exploration mapping data for standardized marine ecological classification of the US Atlantic margin. This is the outline of my talk today. I'll be giving some quick background for context. I'll talk about the study purpose, which was exploring the utility of extended continental shelf data and ocean exploration data for marine habitat classification. I'll discuss study one. My thesis is structured into 3 different papers, basically separate journal articles that are tightly related and kind of build lessons learned one upon the other. Study one was the application of the Coastal and Marine Ecological Classification Standard to Gosnold Seamount. The second study was a standardized geomorphic classification of seafloor within the US Atlantic canyons and continental margin region. Study 3 was a standardized geomorphic characterization of the extensive cold water coral mound province of the Blake Plateau. So under some background here on what is meant by an extended continental shelf. Excuse me, under international maritime law, coastal nation states are recognized to have sovereign rights over marine resources out to 200 nautical miles, the area referred to as the exclusive economic zone. Article 76 of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea also defines formulae for determining a coastal state's potential extended continental shelf. So basically, if you can make a scientific basis that there's a natural prolongation of the continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles, you can make a assertion of a claim for sovereign rights over natural resources of the seabed and subsoil out beyond 200 miles, out to a certain extent. So given this provision, many coastal nation states, including the US, have invested millions of dollars in gathering data about the depth, the shape, and the sediment thickness of these potential ECS areas. One of the key points being that now there's newly acquired bathymetric maps and seismic reflection data for many deep sea regions of the world that until recently have been nearly completely unexplored. This figure shows regions and the years of cruises completed for extended continental shelf mapping work for the United States, which was led by researchers at CCOM-JHC. Data from the Atlantic region shown in yellow was used in my thesis research, so a small portion of what was actually collected. This work that has been completed already represents over 2.5 million square kilometers of area and greater than a $40 million investment by the United States. So a key driver of this research was how else can the value of this data be leveraged for insights into marine habitats. So I just wanted to provide a little bit of context about the issue of sort of scale and resolution and what is meant by marine habitat mapping when you're moving from sort of a data poor status to a data rich status. So for deep sea areas, a lot of times right now we're just gaining the first maps that have ever been obtained. We don't have a lot of information about what's actually on the seafloor until we can send submersibles typically down there to see what's there. So in that case, often you can just do the shape of the seafloor and make maps of major geologic superficial features. If you have more information about the physical, chemical, and biological characteristics of a region, it's possible to conduct statistical analysis of these variables and differentiate distinct biological communities. And then in the case where we have a good understanding of the correlations between species or communities and their environmental variables that support those species, you can generate predictive habitat models. So it's kind of moving down the spectrum to data rich. And for many areas of the deep sea, we're sort of at this part of the spectrum where we're still struggling to get basic ground truth data about what's actually there. So I'm just going to move right into my thesis research. I did habitat classification and characterization studies were completed in 3 distinct regions of the US Atlantic margin. So you can see the US East Coast here and this massive area offshore. I looked at 3 different scales and diversity of marine habitats. The first study was completed offshore in the seamount chain out in the New England seamounts on Gallsnold Seamount. The second study, we expanded those methods out to this very large region of the Atlantic canyons, the continental slope, the abyssal plains, and the seamounts. And the third study, shown here off the coast of Florida and Georgia, was the Blake Plateau. So I'll discuss each one of these studies and some of the key conclusions of each. The first study, application of the Coastal and Marine Ecological Classification Standard to Gallsnold Seamount. So this was essentially a case study completed on a seamount as a relatively small area compared to the rest of the study zone. Proof of concept and really refine the methods that can then be hopefully expanded to the full Atlantic margin region. The paper was published in 2020 as a chapter, Seafloor, Geomorphology is benthic habitat, in the second edition of that book. So some of the fundamental questions I was looking at here was, can broad scale bathymetric data of the US Atlantic margin collected for extended continental shelf and deep sea exploration purposes be used to consistently classify ecological marine units of the seafloor and generate value added characterization maps of large regions, given the scale and the resolution of this particular data? Can characterization maps of the US Atlantic margin be generated using repeatable and efficient semi-automated methods employing the Coastal and Marine Ecological Classification Standard as a standardized organizing framework? So the intent here was really to develop a methodology that was systematic in nature, efficient, and could be applied potentially to other areas of the deep ocean or other extended continental shelf study areas, either in the US or abroad. So a quick introduction to the Coastal and Marine Ecological Classification Standard, CMECS. It's the federally recognized standard for marine habitat mapping in the US. The intent here is to provide a common language to describe coastal and marine habitats, enable integration of data from different sources and study areas, and thereby facilitate regional marine habitat assessment. The CMECS framework is really organized into 4 main components: the water column, the geoform, so that's geomorphology, substrate, and biotic component. Settings and components can be used in combination or independently to describe or map ecosystem features. And the hierarchical arrangement of units enables more in-depth classification as more information is obtained about habitat. So my work focused heavily on the geoform component. As I mentioned, that's kind of one of the things you can do with this level of data that we have for these regions. And where we had information to support it, we also looked at the substrate component and the biotic component, based primarily on observations from submersibles. So for this Gallsnold pilot study, this is showing you an overview of the area that was mapped, was first explored, mapped in detail and explored with ROV dives back in 2014 by NOAA's Office of Ocean Exploration and Research. So we're focusing on this circled area for the pilot study. So I had a goal to classify terrain geomorphology using a repeatable, transparent method that could take advantage of modern spatial analysis software and computing power. So basically not a sort of manual interpretation. And luckily, there was this wonderful tool that was recently developed by Giuseppe Massetti, who's on the call today. It's called the bathymetry and reflectivity-based estimator of seafloor segments, BRES. This is an open source software. You can go to the Hydro Office site with the link here and download this software. It's Python code based, and basically apply it to your own study regions. So the key theoretical basis behind this terrain modeling approach is recognizing that most terrain features can be described by these general archetypes that you see here in the white part of the figure. So for any given cell in a bathymetric grid, the relative position of the surrounding terrain can be assessed as either positive or negative in a line of sight in each of the 8 principal directions around that node. So these landform types can then be grouped and used to classify the bathymetry into these landform classes that you choose. So BRES was used to generate the landform maps that were then further analyzed in ArcGIS Pro software to classify into CMECS geoforms. I'll show what the output of that looks like. So this figure shows the output of the CMECS geoform classification as draped over the bathymetry of the seamount. So geoforms were refined in ArcGIS Pro, then imported into QPS Fledermaus software for the visualization shown here. And just to highlight, like you can see that basically it's doing a good job at picking out the major geomorphic features, this flat top seamount feature in pink, the steep-sided slopes in gray, the yellow ridges, the blue flats. So this is something that could be manually delineated, but this provides a repeatable methodology with clear modeling parameters that can be shared with people. So this table here shows the CMECS geoform classes that were determined for Gosnold Seamount as organized by the CMECS geoform component scheme. So what we had here is that there was existing geoform components that were easily utilized to describe the geoforms, and then there was other areas shown in gray here that are provisional units, meaning they're not currently part of the standard, but we propose them for consideration as part of the standard to more fully describe seamount geomorphic features. This image shows a remotely operated vehicle dive that we did on the site. So it's up on a high ridge of the seamount. The ROV dive data was carefully analyzed and annotated to characterize CMECS substrate and biotic components. This part of the work was completed by Dr. Jen Dykstra and Kristen Mello here at CCOM. So we have these substrate classes that were delineated along 50-meter segments of the ROV track. And just to show you what some of this actually looks like, this is what bedrock seafloor would look like in the video, coral rubble habitat, sand, and then we had another category that was basically a bedrock overlaid by fine unconsolidated sediments. So when you look at this data under a CMECS substrate terminology, you can see that 84% was an unconsolidated fine over bedrock. There was 10% bedrock, 5% sand, and 1% coral rubble along that ROV dive track. So CMECS is providing a way to sort of structure how you analyze, interpret this information. The same was done for the biota. So this is looking at the results of the biological data assessed is represented by the percent of overall counts of the various taxa. So you can see in blue, the counts of individual organisms was heavily dominated by glass sponges shown in blue. This figure shows the biological data when you lump it into community composition groups using CMECS terminology. So analyzing the data by biological assemblage class, glass sponge reef made up a majority of the track, 55%, followed by mixed colonized deep water reef biota, 29%, and 14% was really essentially absent of biota, essentially bare. So the conclusions from this first effort were we utilized the BRES terrain analysis tool to effectively systematically delineate the geomorphic features and found a way to translate those to CMECS geoforms for seamount features. The classification parameters were well documented and are capable of being reproduced by other researchers in other settings. The study largely validated the utility of using CMECS as a systematic classification framework for a deep sea seamount. New provisional CMECS units to more fully describe seamount features were developed. So moving into study 2, the second study really utilized lessons from the first pilot and refined the methodologies for application to a much larger region spanning a greater diversity of topographic relief. The input bathymetry is shown here in the map. It was from a massive bathymetric synthesis grid created by Paul Johnson at CCOM. The source data behind this was from 28 cruises completed both by UNH CCOM for the extended continental shelf mapping, as well as NOAA's Office of Ocean Exploration and Research for initial characterization of the Atlantic submarine canyons and seamounts. So we have these very complementary data sets that can be basically stitched together seamlessly. This study region you see here spans an area twice the size of California. And this particular chapter of work was published in 2020 in the journal Frontiers in Marine Science. This figure shows a summary of the spatial analysis workflow that I used to generate the geomorphic landform maps from the input bathymetry. I won't go into all the nitty-gritty, but the basic key point here is that we found out that applying the BREST terrain analysis tool to such a diverse geography introduced some challenges that we had to address in the study. The landform analysis is really sensitive to the choice of a flatness parameter that you use within the modeling tool. And we determined that a parameter of 5 was appropriate for the steep seamounts, 3 was appropriate for steep continental slopes, and 1 for the abyssal plains. So we generated a flatness mask shown in the middle here, and that had different slope parameters that were used in the model. So we found a way to utilize this method, but applied to a very terrain model that had very different topographic relief throughout different portions of it. And again, we took the output of this landform shown in the purple in the lower right-hand corner, and that was brought into ArcGIS Pro for additional spatial analysis to convert these landform classes into CMECS geoform units. So I want to show a quick fly-through of what the results look like when you drape the landform classifications onto the terrain. So this is draped on the bathymetric surface. The purple represents flats, the green are steep slopes, red are valley features, blue are ridge features. And what we're doing here is flying along the canyon systems, the submarine canyons that are coming off the continental shelf of the East Coast and going down towards the abyssal ocean. And you can see that it's doing a good job at delineating the major geomorphic features of interest. You can really see the gullies and the canyon features coming off the shelf. This is the Blake Ridge, which is a very prominent ridge down here at the Blake Escarpment, Blake Spur, and these deep abyssal bed forms are very clearly called out by this methodology. So yes, you can see these features in the bathymetry, but this is basically classifying a very large region relatively quickly compared to what you would do with a manual interpretation. Back up to the New England seamount chain here. These are very large underwater mountains, and you can see the ridges are highlighted in blue. Most of the terrain there is very steep slopes. So just to give you a sense of what that looks like as an output. That's the same thing. This table, similar to the first study on Gosnold Seamount, I noted that CMECS had some existing units that worked quite well for classifying geoforms of the continental slopes and the abyssal plains, but also lacked some units that would be useful additions to the standard. So those are shown here in gray. The proposed new units are noted, and this is something that's an outcome of the study basically is, okay, how can we maybe update the standard to be most useful for the deep sea? Getting into the results, so this is after I've classified those landform results into CMECS geoform terminology. You can see that the seamount geoforms are dominated by seamount slopes, 80% by area. The second most notable features are seamount ridges, 10%, followed by seamount valleys, which are 8%. The rarity of the geo flat class, that's these flat-topped seamount features, is only 2% of the overall seamount study area. So that has ramifications for conservation and management decisions that might affect those features from a habitat perspective. The results are shown here for the continental slope geoforms. So this is including that area of submarine canyons. 85% of the area is classified as flats, followed by 11% slopes. Ridges and valleys both comprised only 2% each. So this is kind of interesting because our attention is naturally drawn to the dramatic canyon features, but looking kind of out further across the breadth of the continental slope, you still have a lot that's classified as flats. Yes, it's sloping, but it's just a very gentle slope and is therefore classified as a flat. But you can see that the geoform map clearly highlights the extensive network of gullies and canyon valleys that are a signature feature of the region. This is looking at the abyssal geoform results shown on the left. Hard to make out the features at this resolution, but 84% of the area is classified as flats, 13% as slopes, 2% as ridges, and about 1% valleys. The figure on the right shows an interesting region of the study area encompassing the impressive features of the Blake Escarpment, shown here, where the water depths drop off from about 1,200 meters to about 5,000 meters. You can see the Blake Spur and the Blake Ridge, and those are all contributing in different ways to the geomorphology classes that you see here. Also note these dramatic bedform features in the abyssal area. Those are spread out with crest-to-crest distances of about 2,000 to 3,000 meters. So these are very large features. So the significant features of the terrain are well represented in the geoform unit polygons derived from the landforms generated by the automatic delineation algorithm in BRESS. This is showing you the results for the entire margin combined. So abyssal flats make up more than half of the area, 53%, with the continental slope class making up another 30% of the total area, and the abyssal slopes making up another 8%. Flats of any geoform class make up 83% of the study area. Slope classes make up a cumulative total of 13% of the study area, while ridge features comprise only 2%. So one of the outcomes of this type of analysis is basically you have a very thorough inventory of the relative abundance and the aerial coverage of these different types of geoforms. And if you want to devise a research or sampling scheme to target certain areas, you kind of know exactly where to look. So study 2 conclusions. The study demonstrated the utility of the terrain analysis methods and the application of the CMECS standard for inventorying and quantifying areas of each geoform class. The clear advantages of an automatic terrain segmentation approach versus manual delineations for classifying a vast ocean areas was a fundamental highlight of the paper. And the highly diverse terrain covered by the study led to new challenges in parameterizing the terrain analysis tool. And the lessons learned from that experience can be used to guide future applications of the method to other extended continental shelf regions spanning large depth and slope gradients. Study 3 is looking at standardized geomorphic characterization of the extensive cold water coral mound of the Blake Plateau, USA. So the maps you see here, the maps on the left are off the east coast of Florida and Georgia. The different colored polygons you see are separate exploration mapping cruises completed by NOAA's Office of Ocean Exploration and Research using NOAA Ship Okeanos Explorer. The map on the right shows the resulting bathymetric data. And as you can see, we've been systematically mapping this region since 2012. The green striped area you see is yet to be mapped, and hopefully we'll get to that this coming field season. So the main driver of the research question behind this particular study was, can the interpretation of mapping data using the methods developed in study 1 and 2 be used to identify, inventory, and characterize vulnerable cold water coral habitats? So this region has long been known as a hotspot for cold water coral mound features. For those not familiar with deep sea corals, these are filter feeding, in this case, stony corals. They live in complete darkness. They form large coral mound reef structures over thousands of years. These mound reef structures provide very important habitat for diversity of fish and invertebrates. They're slow growing, long-lived, and fragile habitats, so that makes them vulnerable to any seafloor disturbance activities. And the extent and number of mounds just being revealed by recent explorations that have just been done the last few years. I did also want to point out that the Gulf Stream moves from north to south right over this entire province. So This light green is the western boundary of the main axis of the Gulf Stream, and the darker green here is the eastern boundary. And it's really just constantly bringing turbulence and food supply to this habitat area. The white polygon that you see here is actually a protection zone that was set up by the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council. It's designated as a habitat area of particular concern because of the corals, and it prohibits bottom contact fishing and anchoring activities. I just want to show you pictures worth 1,000 words. This was the bathymetric synthesis grid I made out of 20 different multi-beam sonar surveys over this region. So the intent here was to provide a very seamless grid without a lot of artifacts from different surveys or poor weather conditions. So I did spend a lot of time cleaning and making sure that the data was as high quality a grid as it could be. And what you see here is many of these small peak features are these coral mounds I just described. And this area that you see now was just recently mapped within the last 2 years. This is called the Richardson Reef or Richardson Mounds area. It's been referred to by many scientists. And as you can see, there's some steep geologic scarps that are in the topography here. And the coral mounds are these, you can see them as these bumps around the fringes of those dramatic scarps, in some cases forming long continuous or nearly continuous reef tracts. Right now, you're seeing a very dense aggregation of mounds. That one, for the study purpose, was nicknamed streamline mounds. In this area, you see these very small features. So this is just a quick fly through of the terrain to give you a sense of what the overall area looks like, and then we'll go into more detail qualitatively and quantitatively to describe these features. So first, the significance of this coral mound province as a whole. This provides a nearly continuous cold water coral area up to 472 kilometers long and 88 kilometers wide. So that this is shown in white on the right on this map. That white polygon is 6.9 million acres. So for comparison, that's about 3 times the size of Yellowstone National Park. Within that, the yellow polygon that I delineated is this core of very dense mounds. So basically where one mound ends, there's another one right adjacent to it. That is about 1.2 million acres, which is greater than the Grand Canyon National Park. So you start to think about the size of these features and the extent that we're talking about. So what we have documented with this mapping information is the largest continuous cold water coral mound province yet discovered worldwide in the published literature anyway. So probably more out there, but for now, this is appears to be the largest when defined that way. Also wanted to point out what an individual cold water coral mound feature looks like in the bathymetry. So that's on the left. And then on the right is what you would get with the landform interpretation that we're using. You can see that it's picking out the peak, ridge features, the slopes, flats, and there's a little valley tucked away in there. The reason this matters is because a coral mound is comprised of the peak, ridge, and slope features, and all of which tend to be dominated by coral-affiliated substrates like live coral, dead coral, or coral rubble, all of which is providing very important habitat substrate for the ecosystem there. The submersible dives that have documented the living corals, if present, in the standing coral structures tend to cluster on peaks and ridges. So near these peaks and ridges is where you're going to tend to find the living coral communities, oftentimes if they're there, as well as some of the sort of intact coral structure. So when you delineate these peak features, it provides a way to automatically count the number of coral mounds in a region while quickly estimating the aerial coverage of these various geomorphic features. So this is a 3D view of the dense area of coral mounds. We're calling this million mounds. So you can see each of those little mounds is actually a coral feature documented by our ground truth dives there. And this is the same area as classified using these different geomorphic landforms. So you can see that delineating all of this information out by hand would be difficult to nearly impossible with a similar level of detail. When you look at the results in aggregate, the plot here is showing you the cumulative area in square kilometers of each of those classes. You can see that the peak class is quite small relative to flats, but ecologically very important. So it provides a nice way to kind of quickly inventory the landscape you have here and sort of characterize the coral mound province. So I noticed in looking in detail at all these different areas within this whole region that there was 8 subregions that displayed very unique mound distribution and vertical relief characteristics. So I really wanted to describe these qualitatively and quantitatively in more depth. So that's these black polygons that you see on the map are sub areas that were delineated out for further analysis. So we'll take a look at them sort of qualitatively, what they look like. I'm going to show a series of maps, 2 for each subregion. These are meant to highlight the morphological diversity of coral mounds in different subregions. So I like to think of these as essentially morphological fingerprints. The map on the left shows graduated vertical mound relief symbols on top of bathymetry, which is you'll see over here. So the larger the red dot, essentially the larger relief it's having from surrounding terrain. So the taller the mound is elevated from the seafloor. So this provides a quick visual. Each one of these red dots is a coral mound, and then the bigger the dot, just the taller the mound. On the right is the same area, so area A, and then this is just the landform classification of that same region. The black outlines show you the area I traced out for further quantitative analysis of the peak features. So it's notable in both regions A and B in this figure that the highest relief mounds are found at the top of the steep scarp features, forming long, nearly continuous reefs. As you can see, this is very large relief mounds right along the edge of the scarp and smaller as you move away. The area C, we are called streamline mounds as a nickname. It shows very tight clustering of mounds that are also directionally oriented with an elongated morphology. It's hard to see in this image, but you can see the tight clustering of the mounds in the image on the left. The next area below, ripple mounds. This was highlighted because it had a very unique pattern I didn't see anywhere else. It's formed this sort of ripple bed form pattern. You can see over here quite clearly, it makes these long linear features. And if you look at the relief of each of these mounds, they're quite uniform across that area. Area E, pinnacle mounds. This area had very distinct pinnacle shaped mounds. So a lot of mounds are sort of multi-peaked. On this one, a lot of them were just individual. So kind of a unique morphology. Whoops. And then area F, nicknamed mini mounds, due to the very small size of the mounds in this region. Again, you can see that they're notably uniform in spacing and the height of the mounds. This top region's nicknamed sparse mounds. This was an area that was newly mapped, and we found these large mounds that were solitary and widely spaced apart. However, the mounds here are some of the tallest in the whole region and are remarkably uniform in height. The last one here, area H, million mounds. This is a part of this overall area because it's so large and long. It's just striking for the sheer number and density of mound features, as you can see. It's totally outstanding in the area. So this table here provides a summary comparison of the quantitative morphology metrics that I looked at for these 8 cold water coral mound subregions. The standout numbers have been highlighted in the tan color in the table. And I just want to highlight a few things for you. This million mounds region that we just looked at visually has 24,819 individual mound features. That's about 42% of the total number of mounds mapped in the entire region thus far. You can see that the peak density, 4.8 mounds per square kilometer, is also quite high. Streamlined mounds, by the way, was almost at the same density. And you can see that the area of peaks and ridges was quite a bit larger than other regions. Other highlights of this are that the Million Mounds region had the biggest minimum depth of corals. So corals could be found at 356 meters all the way down to 918 meters. In the Richardson Mounds areas, also another standout, this had the highest range for mound relief. So this is how much the mounds are standing up above the surrounding seafloor. The highest maximum values, mean, median, and standard deviations. So I want to look at some graphs of these and call out some things in more depth. This figure is showing you the maximum single vertical relief as orange. So you can see that Richardson Reef had the largest vertical relief of any of the areas. Million mounds and jellyfish essentially tied a second for the highest mounds. And then you can see that sparse mounds and pinnacle mounds also were pretty similar in terms of their highest. When you look at the mean and the median relief numbers, which are probably more meaningful, you can see that Richardson still has the highest value, so 44 meters as an average and 35 meters of relief as the median value. You can see that this is followed by sparse mounds. So even while sparse mounds does not have a great number of mounds, the mounds that are present are on average some of the largest in the region. And these mounds are currently located outside the coral protection boundary. When we start to look at the mound depth, so this is the depth below sea level at which the coral mound peaks occur in each of these subregions. The green bars represent the range of depths that are found in those subregions. The yellow bars are the maximum depths, and the orange bars are the minimum depths and the maximum depths. So looking at the green bar, you can see that million mounds was again this sort of standout here, with corals occurring over a range of 562 meters. They contain both the shallowest 356 meters and the deepest coral occurrence at 918. You can see that the others have much narrower depth ranges, and sparse and mini mounds have mounds that occur at very uniform depths. Shown here, they do not cover a large depth range. All of the mound peaks in the regions fall within the depth range of 350 to 900 meters. The map on the left here shows the 23 submersible dives that have been completed in the region over the last few years. 12 dives were annotated by Ryan Gasborough and other graduate students in Eric Cordes' lab at Temple University, and 11 dives were annotated by NOAA OER staff and Deep Coral Ecology lab staff for these substrate annotations. So we had 23 dives in total shown here, 15 from OER's Deep Discover ROV, 4 from Alvin, which is a human-occupied sub, and 4 from Jason, which is another ROV. Every minute of those dives was annotated for what the substrate was, resulting in 6,081 substrate class annotations total over this region. And the substrate terminology was standardized to CMECS, so we're kind of comparing apples to apples. This is what the substrate classes look like in these coral reef areas. So at the top left, you have what a live reef would look like. This is Lophelia pertusa. Below that is what those corals might look like when they're dead. So that you still have coral standing structure providing habitat, but the coral itself is not living anymore. And then typically moving down slope a little, you have these large fields of coral rubble. This is not from damage, this is just a natural degradation and what this habitat looks like after thousands of years of growth and change. There's a bedrock class. We found large areas of cobble and then fine unconsolidated sediments. So a key question we had was, how does the substrate class differ with the landform classes that we defined? So this plot shows the primary substrate types observed for each landform class. The y-axis is the cumulative percentage of all the substrate annotations for that landform class. This is important because it shows the relative substrate composition of each geomorphic landform that we explored. So starting at the bottom, this blue class is this essentially live reef. You can see that only about 2% of the observations in slope geoforms had live reef, 2% in the ridge, and then 7% in the peaks. So again, the live coral tends to be higher elevated relief, up more in the peak geoforms. Moving up a bit into the coral reef substrate, this is that dead standing framework. You can see 6% of the slope had this, 18 of the ridge, 26 of the peaks. So again, as you move higher up on these mound features, you're getting more of this framework that provides important habitat structure. This gray area is clearly dominant. That's coral rubble. It's very prominent in the peak, ridge, slope, and valley landforms. So as it's found in these three classes, as I mentioned before, this is kind of the slope, ridge, and peaks kind of comprise the mound features themselves. And so just having this documentation of what substrate's actually there essentially validates our interpretation of the bathymetric features as cold water coral mounds. So this analytical approach really provides a useful way to utilize the substrate observations from the submersible dive video to characterize the substrate makeup of the geomorphic units. To summarize for this region, we had newly discovered potential coral mounds in complex scarp terrain outside the existing coral protection boundary. So these green polygons basically show you where we documented these sort of complex habitat types outside of the current protection boundary. And we conveyed these results directly through a presentation recently to the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council. And they'll take that information to support their ecosystem-based management decisions and conservation measures to protect the cold water coral habitats here. So the study 3 conclusions were that the study demonstrated the value of applying an objective automated terrain segmentation and classification approach to geomorphic characterization of a highly complex cold water coral mound province. Manual delineation of these features in a consistent, repeatable way with a comparable level of detail would not have been possible. These methods also provided a pragmatic, standardized approach for identifying, characterizing, and quantifying the cold water coral mound forming habitats and could be applied to other cold water coral mound provinces to enable more direct comparisons among geographically diverse settings, which would be interesting to do because these are found all around the world. Summarizing the overall research conclusions of all 3 studies, the geomorphic classification approach developed is repeatable, time efficient, and scalable to very large ocean regions. This work was one of the few studies to date to apply the CMECS standard to deep sea habitats. So an outcome of that was that we generated specific new proposed units tailored to the deep sea. CMECS was demonstrated to be an effective organizational framework for marine ecological classification. It accommodated broad scale, low resolution data that we had, as well as the fine scale biological and substrate data, such as what we obtained from the ROV dives. The methods proved effective at identifying, quantifying, and characterizing cold water coral mound habitats, as we just saw in the last study. Outputs from this work may help improve the spatial resolution and accuracy of cold water coral models. This is actually an area of active research. The modelers over at Eric Cordez's lab are working on seeing if the spatial outputs from the work done here are useful for more of a typical modeling approach, a predictive substrate distribution model. Sorry, a coral distribution model. There's dramatically increased amount of deep ocean mapping data being generated. As we saw, as many nations are doing extended continental shelf studies. And the study approach provides a blueprint framework that can be applied to other ECS regions or deep sea environments that have comparable input data sets available. Therefore, the study demonstrated how to maximize the value of deep sea mapping and exploration data sets for marine habitat characterization, hopefully useful for supporting ecosystem-based management of the ocean. With that, I just want to acknowledge my doctoral committee and many others. We introduced the committee to start with. I want to thank you all for your expertise and willingness to be on the committee. I want to thank NOAA's Office of Ocean Exploration and Research, first of all, for funding the exploration data gathering that was used in all this work. The leadership support I've had over the years from everyone on the leadership team, my fellow mappers, and have been great, highly supportive as I increased their workload as I worked on other things. So that was much appreciated support. Casey Cantwell, Heather Coleman, Kim Galvez for helping me get the results of this work out to the managers in the region for the Blake Plateau. JC Coffee and the Cherokee Nation businesses, that's my employer as a contractor. And many scientists here at CCOM, particularly Giuseppe Massetti. I would not have been able to advance on this work without his brilliance in coding and many discussions on how to apply his methodology. Paul Johnson's work on the synthesis. Kristen Mello did a great deal of interpretation of video, documentation of the substrate and biota. Inspiration from all the rest of the folks on this list. Officers and crews of the NOAA Ship Okeanos Explorer. Our survey tech, our senior survey tech on the ship is a great friend of mine and really made sure that the data quality that we collected throughout this work was very high. The Global Foundation for Ocean Exploration, responsible for the quality of the ROV data, much of which was collected through this work. And finally, my wife and family, thank you for all your support. Really appreciate it. So with that, we can move to questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Derek. I think we can give you a virtual round of applause. And even a applause symbols on there. Now, I apologize. There's actually concrete being poured over my shoulder right now. And so I don't know if you can hear that happening. I hope not. So I'll try to keep myself muted as much as possible. Now we get to the difficult part in this sort of environment, and that's having questions. I'm seeing lots of congratulatory notes in the chat, but we'd also like to see some questions. I see Tom Lippman has raised his hand. That's working very well. So do turn on your cameras if you want, and raise your hand. We'll try to get you. Go ahead, Tom. Turn on your microphone. Go ahead, and I'm going to shut mine off.
All right, thanks, Larry. Appreciate it. Thank you, Derek. Very nicely done. Appreciate that. So I'm going to reveal some of my ignorance in this topic of these cold, deep coral reefs, but I have some questions about it. So do these mounds have to exist before the coral can settle on it, or are the coral actually creating the mounds themselves through time? Do they start on a flat plateau and build the mound, or is the mound already?
Yeah, it's more the latter. So typically they need some sort of hard substrate to initially settle on, and that could be just like a drop stone or a just exposed bedrock or cobble or anything like that. And then they'll colonize that, and then as that first generation dies, they'll actually leave their skeletal framework behind. That'll settle out sediments out of the water column. And so this happens over generations and generations. The skeletal framework builds and build with the calcareous skeletons, and then that structure itself settles the sediments out, and then this thing just accretes over time. So the structures you see there are very, very old. Some of these things have been cored and are, thousands and thousands of years old. So those are called biogenic mounds because they're created sort of by the biology. And then over time, some of these areas lithify, they'll actually condense and lithify into basically a hard conglomerate. Those are called lithoherms. So I think you're seeing both there in that region.
So they start mostly with a flat plateau, and then they build the mound themselves through time.
It appears that way, and then sometimes it seems like the underlying geology kind of is structuring where and how they grow. In other cases, there's evidence to suggest that the mound features themselves, as they're forming, they're changing the hydrodynamics in the region locally, as well as over quite large scales, even as deep as like 600 meters. They're changing the flux of particles from the surface and changing the actual hydrodynamics of the region above them. So some of these areas might be sort of self-organizing because they're using up food in some areas, and then there'll be a certain sort of dearth of food behind a mound that's not supportive of coral. So I think it's kind of still open question as to how, what are the relative strength of these factors in different settings.
It's interesting because you find that they exist between 300 and 900 meters, or some range of depth. So if they're forming themselves, somehow building, they somehow only live within that range. What is the magic range that they live in? Is that due to the Gulf Stream influence, the depth of the Gulf Stream? In other words, would you have to have a western boundary current in order to have these? Or what is the reason why they have this funky depth range, or limited depth range, I should say?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of factors, but depth, the supply of nutrients, I'm sure it varies by the species. Oxygen, the saturation point of aragonite. There's a lot of environmental controls, but they're kind of species specific. So the tolerances of different coral species are going to vary. I'm not a coral expert, don't pretend to be, but it's kind of an interesting study because it's sort of bridging the gap between the biology and the mapping. The people that focus on the mapping.
Thank you, appreciate that. Yeah,
thanks, Tom. I see Kim Lowell has a question. Kim, go ahead, turn on your mic and fire away.
With the breast tool, you mentioned that you had a number of tuning parameters that you had to play with a little bit, which is quite typical for that sort of thing. I'm just curious about the robustness of those parameters. Would one given set of those tuning parameters work for all of the areas you looked at, and or did you have to adjust them if you were in areas where there were more pits or troughs or slopes? How robust are they from one area to another and along the same ROV track?
Well, I think it was clear that you fine tune these based on the features of interest that you're trying to delineate out of the terrain. So some of the key parameters in that tool are there's sort of an inner search radius that you're looking out from a given node in the bathymetry grid. And then there's an outer radius. So that's as far out as you're going to look for changes in slope or the relative position. So those are key parameters, and that kind of scales to the size of the feature you're trying to highlight. So if you're looking for very small scale or small fine scale features, you're going to set that window pretty small. If you're looking for very large relief geomorphic features, you're going to set that search radius quite large. And so that's something that you will figure out as you know what you're looking for, and you have the given resolution of the bathymetric data, which is a hard limit on a lot of those questions. The other key parameter is the flatness parameter. So this is the angle you're looking out from that initial node. You're looking for changes in vertical relief, positive or negative, and that it is sensitive to that. So you're basically doing sort of a trial and error of seeing what result gives you a delineation that was essentially equivalent to what you would delineate, if you were an expert trying to delineate the main geomorphic features of interest. So I'd say, yes, it is something that you tailor to a study region, and not one set of parameters is going to fit all different settings and different resolutions. I will say, though, that one strength of the approach is that because it's a line of sight method, it's not just a fixed radius of grid cells that you're like a moving window algorithm. So it's within those search radius that you specify. It can look very short if there's a feature of interest there, or it can look out beyond that. So it sort of self-scales in some ways, which is a pretty nice attribute of the tool.
All right, thank you.
Okay, I think Mimi and her assistant have a question.
Yep, hi, congratulations. That was a great presentation. Torrin says congrats too, he's painting. It's so exciting to see such in-depth analysis of such large data sets. And I was wondering if you've identified any kind of like target-rich areas in the US EZ data sets that exist that you think would be logical to apply this to next.
You mean outside of the Atlantic margin, other areas?
Yeah.
To be honest, I've been so busy working on that region, I haven't looked in depth at other regions. But that being said, I have seen the bathymetry, beautiful bathymetry that's been collected, and I am sure that there's many useful insights you could gain by applying this method to those regions.
Cool, thanks.
Sure.
Okay. Dave Mosier.
Thanks, Larry, and thank you, Derek. That was a tremendous effort too. I have to congratulate you. I know this is not easy to do at any time, particularly on a part-time basis. I take my hat off to you. I don't recommend even master students take it on part-time. So to do a PhD is just an incredible accomplishment. I have a bunch of questions, some of them more challenging than others, but I'll start off with a geological question, I guess. As a geologist, looking at this margin, I see something different than what you've classified, and I see it's either missed or you've chosen not to break the margin into these groups. So the upper slope is a steep slope, and you capture it with all the canyons and valleys and ridges, but you don't capture it in the sense that it's an oversteepened portion of the slope, and that's long been recognized by geologists dating back even to Heezen. And then we go into the contorites like the Chesapeake Drift, and then the Hatteras Outer Ridge, and even the Blake Ridge. These are massive contorite features that surely are a different habitat than say a normal slope. And yet these chondrites are common on all margins, but massive off the US margin and the Argentinian margin, for example. and yet, you know, like the Chesapeake Drift is classified as part of your slope. The Hatteras Drift is classified as part of your abyss, and they're not uniquely identified, I guess. And I'm wondering why that is. Is it a function of the scales of resolution of the study, or is that chosen by purpose?
Well, I think that my answer would be that it's sort of a different map product with a different interpretation. So what you're talking about requires, you know, geologic expertise. I'm not a geologist, and it would have, you're looking more at the geologic processes that form these large features, whereas the terrain analysis that I did is really just looking for the sort of superficial expression of these types. And I would maybe argue a little bit that from a habitat perspective, like what the biology is responding to and seeing, maybe it doesn't matter as much how a feature was formed as much as what habitat it's providing at the time in terms of the local conditions that the organism is seeing or the community is seeing. So I think, yes, I don't see it as supplanting what you're talking about, which is the expert interpretation of geologic processes along a margin. I think that is a different maybe product and a different approach. So yes, the work I showed you definitely has those limitations. It's not meant to be a process interpretation, but more of what do you see there as something you can classify pretty simply. And you know, it's got limitations there, but hopefully still useful.
I guess I think you purposely say in your thesis that you don't include water column information, and I agree, that'd be a massive undertaking in its own right. But if an area is undergoing active sediment transport, and we believe like Hatteras Drift is still active, and Blake Ridge, surely that's a separate habitat, even though, you know, it's geologic processes that formed it. It even today would be a distinctive habitat because of being, you know, bathed in these deep water currents. But I want to put on my Canadian hat for a minute and take you to task on something. Your figure 1.1 says that you go from Florida to the US-Canada border, but you include a multi-beam data set off Nova Scotia. So you might want to rectify that you
crossing boundaries.
Call it the Northwest Atlantic margin or something. After January, we might be willing to join you, but right now, no. And the border's still closed, so you're not even allowed to come visit. And in that regard too, I do want to encourage you maybe to acknowledge the Canadian Extended Continental Shelf program, because we paid $5 million for that data set that the Atlantis acquired off Nova Scotia. So there was a significant contribution from the Canadian Extended Continental Shelf program. I have other questions, but I don't want to take up all the time and leave it open for other questions. So let's let other people ask some questions, and if there's a lull, I'll come back. Thank you, Derek.
I don't see any more questions in the chat, but I would like to move around to the other committee members. So Mark, are you out there? And if you have a question, and you don't have to, but you're most welcome to ask one or two.
Yes, thank you. And I wasn't sure whether to add my questions here or in our private session, but
I'd rather the questions be discussed with everybody if we
okay,
can.
Great. So I think each of your three studies is a work in itself. Tremendous information that's inherent in the results that you've produced so far. And I'm really eager to ask you more deep questions related to the parameters associated with how the breasts worked in those different environments. I think Kim sort of alluded to a question that's in my mind, is how transferable are these parameters? And what I think your studies demonstrate is where you've achieved success. What would also be interesting to me is where you've encountered failure. So what are the boundaries beyond which these parameters start to fall apart? And maybe that's a whole other dissertation, but just your thoughts in terms of what the lessons are from those different parameters.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe more the hardest challenges there is to, I mean, you're trying to come up with a method that's systematic and repeatable, but it still, of course, has subjectivity built into it because you're making decisions about the search radius you're looking out to try to define features and the flatness parameter you're using. So it's inherently still, somewhat subjective to the researcher, of course. The idea behind it was really to have an approach where at least put the methodology out there. People can fine tune it to their study sites, and hopefully it delivers a result that is meaningful for their management decision making purposes or ecological understanding of their study area. But yeah, we definitely wrestled with how to fine tune those parameters and what's a good outcome versus, why is one model output better than the other? And I think there's some subjectivity there. And it's basically, I would drape the outputs of the results on the bathymetry and say, do these delineation breaks make sense? Would you choose to do, say the valley stops here and the slope starts there, and it's, there's subjectivity there, certainly. So I don't think, like, anytime you draw a hard line in a seascape, it's somewhat artificial, right? It's a human construct over a very complex and patchy environment. So it's a broad brush approach. It's generalizing a complex system into very simple sort of building blocks. So yeah, take those limitations as they are, but it's still an interpreted product that provides hopefully some additional insights beyond just a bathymetric data set. Yeah, the other thing is just the issue of scale is always a challenge. So we're dealing with ground truth data, collected by either drop cameras or ROVs or human occupied subs, with a very small window on what's actually down at the seafloor. Relative to the area of the bathymetry, it's minuscule. So you're trying to extrapolate an understanding from very limited small areas to very huge areas, and there's just an inherent mismatch of scale. And the same was true when I did spend a lot of time looking at backscatter, which I didn't present today because I didn't have results that are meaningful to share with this group, but it wasn't for a lack of effort. So again, there's just, when you're surveying the seafloor with a multi-beam mounted on a ship that's very far away, the resolution of the data is a little bit of a mismatch to try to compare against your ground truth. So those are some of the challenges that we ran up against.
Great, thank you. Catherine.
Derek, that's amazing. This whole study has been fantastic. I really enjoyed reading your thesis. I think it's so well done. And it really is, as other people have said, it's really inspirational that you managed to do this while working a full-time job. So congratulations. One of my questions is related to something that David brought up. I was surprised not to see the continental rise, and I was wondering if you could explain that in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, so I struggled with how to define that because the Atlantic margin's interesting in that it's pretty diverse. Like, there's some areas where it's sort of like this classic profile, and there's other areas where it's very unusual and unique. And trying to define where a break would be between a slope and a rise, trying to find like a slope value, for instance, that makes sense across the entire study region. I wasn't able to find one that really made sense for the whole study region. So how do you delineate a boundary that varies across those features? Because if you look at the Blake Escarpment in the south, it's basically dropping extremely steeply from 1,200 meters down to 5,000. And it's just this huge topographic break. And then you have the Blake Plateau, where you have sort of a mid-depth large plateau feature right in the middle of the slope. And then further north, you have a little bit more of what people would sort of look at as more of a textbook margin profile. So I looked at trying to define like an isobath that made sense as a depth break that could be defined along the whole region. And it didn't seem to offer any, I couldn't find a way to do it cleanly, and it didn't seem to offer any really distinctive benefits to differentiate between the slope and the rise.
Okay. And I did have one other relatively quick question. So I noticed that the HAPC boundary really doesn't capture some of the coral mound habitat that exists to the east of the boundary. Can you describe how the HAPC boundary was drawn and why it doesn't incorporate those habitats? Did they not know about them, or was there some other reason?
Yeah, I think the main reason being they hadn't been mapped at all yet. So until the past few years, and some of that data was literally from last field season, so this past year, or well, 2019. So there was just not the data to support that there was even mound features there. I think the council did a remarkably good job at protecting areas of corals even before they had knowledge of the exact location. So I can't, I don't know why they drew exactly the boundaries that they did, but I think they did, some of the early exploration work on the Blake Plateau was very essential. Like, it absolutely went straight to their management decisions. They said, okay, you just discovered this, this deep sea habitat here. We're gonna expand the boundaries. So they've expanded and adjusted as new information has come in, and expressed the openness to potentially do that with new information that is being discovered now.
Thanks. I'll
Thank you.
pass for now.
Okay, Jen.
Yeah, so going back to a question that I think Mark had is how much does the resolution of the, or maybe the footprint of this, of the resolution of the multi-beam affect your results? So in one location, you have a 35-meter resolution, and then in another location, you have a 100-meter resolution. And how does that affect kind of that fine scale classification of ridge versus valley versus something else?
Yeah, I mean, it's directly intertwined. There's, yeah, that's the truth. I mean, you can't do more with the scale than you have. So out on the extended continental shelf region, I was working basically with a 100-meter resolution input bathymetry grid. So obviously you can't resolve any features finer than that. But given that that area is so vast and the features are so big in terms of vertical relief, the delineation does a good job at highlighting the size of those features at the scale of sort of interest. Now, of course, you could do an AUV dive on a portion of a seamount and find, it would basically be a totally separate analysis, I would think, like more of a multi-scale. So the finer resolution data you have, the finer the habitat detail you could delineate out. And I think you'd find a tighter correlation between that information and what the biology is actually responding to. Because I know that, you know, if we're delineating out a ridge feature over 100 kilometers, and within that, there's very fine pockmarks or walls or, you know, boulder fields that you just can't resolve at that resolution. Those are critically important for defining what species, you know, their preferences for habitat there. So of course, that's a huge limitation of coarse resolution data. In the case of the Blake Plateau, with a 35-meter resolution grid, luckily, I think it does capture most of the likely cold water coral mound features there, because once we were able to demonstrate basically mound features with as little as 10 meters of vertical relief from the seafloor, so those are pretty small. You can still resolve pretty easily from the terrain. So there may be even smaller features, and you can't find them given that resolution. So of course, if you go in with an AUV or something that can get very high resolution, I think you'd have a separate, you know, scale of classification and have more insights that are probably more relevant to the biology's response there.
I had a follow-up question. Oh, sorry, no, I can wait. I can wait.
No, if you have another, go ahead now.
Okay. So you mentioned backscatter and that you had tried to use backscatter. And what did you find was the challenges about that, about using it?
Well, I think one of the challenges was that, so it's worth mentioning there's actually a whole separate module to BRESS as a tool that utilizes backscatter data. So you can put in a multi-beam backscatter mosaic, and it has a segmentation process. So you can use both information. This is one of the primary drivers behind the development of the tool, that actually was to look at the bathymetry and the backscatter and glean useful information from it. One of the challenges I had was that when you're breaking up the terrain into backscatter of different sort of textures and intensities, you are introducing many classes. So you're making it pretty complex. And ultimately, I was trying to simplify and winnow down to some very simple classes for the seafloor. The other thing that was hard is it's just a stochastic measurement. As you can see, the data sets I used were merged of many, many different multi-beam surveys. So each one of those multi-beams is on a different ship with a different, in some cases, a different sonar using a totally different frequency, not calibrated to any standard. So it's, you're using kind of apples and oranges to try to get a signal to understand a seafloor inherent properties like a substrate. I really wanted to generate broad scale substrate maps for these study regions, but trying to do it with all those factors I just mentioned is very difficult. And I don't feel like to answer a lot of that adequately to characterize the substrate, I don't think the science is quite there yet. So I did spend a lot of time kind of trying to figure out that aspect, but it didn't fit well with the rest of the study objectives of really trying to simplify matters instead of making it more complicated. Yeah, that's one of the answers for backscatter. Still useful. I'm not saying it's not useful. I'm just saying it's, as you're merging backscatter from many different sources, it is hard to sort of.
Yeah, it's another few theses, I think, in there. Now we had a question from Kim Galvez, but he seems to have had to run. So I'll ask you to answer his question offline in the chat.
He's a ROV expedition coordinator for OER.
He had a good question, and so he deserves an answer. Juliet, you had a question? No, Juliet, I'll come back to Dave Mosier then.
Okay, thanks. So Derek, I'll go back to resolution again. And in chapter 4, page 94, you say the minimum mapping size for geomorphic analysis is 35 meters, but sampling theorem would suggest that you need at least 2 samples to resolve a feature. And in fact, in 3 dimensions, you would need a minimum of 3 samples in opposite direction. So you're all of a sudden looking at 70 by 70 meters, which is almost 5 square kilometers as sort of a minimum detection size. Do you have experience do you think you can resolve things finer than that? And maybe you can't use the grid for that, but have to actually go to the raw sounding data.
Yeah. I understand what you're talking about in terms of, like, we do that in terms of wreck detection and things like that. But I'm trying to think it out. In some ways, I think a lot of the statistics and the approach taken in BRESS is on a node by node basis. So you're looking at each individual cell in a raster grid, and then you're comparing it to the surrounding terrain. So I think maybe the minimum mapping unit would really be more oriented to how you set the window that you're looking out from that cell. So if you're looking out, like one of the features is you can set an inner radius where you're not looking locally, you're looking out a little further to avoid noise in the grid. So yes, I think that would affect the minimum mapping unit because you're intentionally telling it not to look close to that node. So I think I'd have to look at that point and probably adjust the language there to reflect a more accurate minimum mapping unit.
Yeah, I think
thanks for
that's my
pointing that out.
Yeah. Sort of a generic question, or what are your thoughts about integrating the third dimension that below the seafloor, so sub-bottom data, for example? And the reason I ask, obviously substrate would be important for any habitat mapping, but if you identify shallow gas, for example, it's a paradigm shift in terms of the biological community that you would expect at that location. So it's sort of an important parameter, certainly in some circumstances. So what are your thoughts? I know it would add great complexity, but what are your thoughts on that?
I think obviously it's an excellent point. We have, oh man, so much. We have a lot of, at least shallow, our ship alone collects chirp data. So it's not deep seismic, obviously, but it is sub-bottom data. So a lot could be done with that. And I did consider using it, but it's just a huge amount of analysis. Also not my expertise. The interpreting the shallow geology should be done by a geologist. But I do think, you know, when I was writing up the article on the coral district, I think the next logical thing is to do just that, is to look at the sub-bottom data, seismic data if it exists, and that'll give you a much better handle on how much of the coral mound structure appears to be biogenic as versus sort of more of a shallow feature on top of the underlying geology. So I think that's kind of fundamental to really characterizing that coral province. So I was just really looking at the terrain expression, but the sub-bottom would be hugely important to analyze to really, you know, more fully and accurately characterize like how much of these mound features appear to be biogenic. And then of course, drilling, like taking cores of these features to age them and to see kind of, to better understand sort of the evolution of the structures over time would be a major insight into what's going on there.
Okay, thank you, Derek.
Okay, I'll make a last call for questions. Either just start flapping on the video or put it in the chat. And I'm not seeing any. So then let me once again publicly thank Derek for all his effort. And as people have mentioned, it's not a trivial thing to do this while you're working. And again, so thank your supervisors allowing you to take the time to do it, and you for putting that effort in. And I think we all see it was an excellent effort. So with that, I'll ask for one more round of applause, and then I'm going to ask all of us, even the committee members, to leave this link, and that you all have another link, and we'll join privately on that one and continue our discussion with Derek and then amongst ourselves. So thank you very much, Derek. I will leave the applause.
Thank you for joining. I really appreciate the support and interest.
And again, I wish we could all be together and give you a kick. All right, so bye-bye, everybody. Thank you.